Alrighty, welcome back. Lesson 9. This bad boy. Okay, I didn't break it. Cool. Our dot point today is the relationship of access and consumption to, and there's a few things here, 6, age, class, ethnicity, gender, location, sexuality. So there's a lot of different things we need to cover here. So, because of the way my headings work, don't engage with this first. Engage with the table here first, as I've instructed you here. So step 1 in bold is interact with the table on page 25. And then step 2 is to complete a HSC question on page 24 here. So the first thing you need to do is interact here with this table. And then the info from this table will allow you to answer this question. Okay? So we're looking at the relationship of access and consumption to age, class, ethnicity. So I've broken it up here into 2 things. So we've broken it up. We've got age, class, ethnicity, gender, location, sexuality down here. And I've broken it up to who has access versus who doesn't, because that's the first part of our dot point, the relationship of access in regards to age. So if I'm to talk about, I'll go through a couple of these as an example. And then the second one is the relationship of consumption in relation to it. So when we're talking about age, I'm talking about which kind of age groups have access to it. And then here I'm talking about how do these age groups consume it. Okay, here I'm talking about the types of ethnicity that may have access to sitcoms. And here I'm talking about how different ethnicities might consume it. Yeah? Which genders have access to sitcoms versus how do they consume it here. Okay, so I'll go through these. So if we're to look at and highlight this as you go, so age is our first one. When we're talking about who has access to sitcoms here, pretty much everyone except toddlers, and that's mainly due to parental censorship, but it's also mainly due to the fact that it would be very hard for a toddler to comprehend a sitcom in terms of the characters, the plot line, and everything. So if you were to get asked a HSC question on this, you would say that everyone has access. I just put this here as a, if anyone wants to technically, get uppity at me and say toddlers don't have access, there's your little foolproof asterisk there. But pretty much everyone has access to sitcoms. If you're a child, you've got the really young sort of Nickelodeon type sitcoms, things like iCarly. If you're a teenager, it bumps up a bit more even. You've got things like Hannah Montana, again on that Nickelodeon network, or is that I think that's a Disney one, that one actually. So children have access to it, teenagers have access to it. Adults and young adults definitely have access to a variety of different sitcoms, and I've just put in brackets this I guess the target audience as an example. There are more sitcoms than one, obviously, that are catered to them. But adults have it, the ones like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. The elderly have it in terms of Brady Bunch and classic sitcoms of their era and time, and then families as well. I know that's not technically an age, but if you were to class them as a consumer market in pop culture, things like Modern Family, Everybody Loves Raymond, The Simpsons, are all very much family-orientated sitcoms. So everyone has access to sitcoms. And if we look at technology as well, which isn't one here, remember the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, said every household in Australia pretty much has a TV, so everyone kind of have access to it there as well. Not to say that, in Broken Hill there might not be reception one day. I'm sure that happens, but you get my drift. Now, in terms of how the age group consumes sitcoms, its main commercial strength, again, is that they appeal to a wide range of age groups. So these guys consume it in relation to age. They definitely have easy access, and they can consume it all. So there's nothing, I guess, nuanced there. Again, the only one that can't is toddlers. The only way that an age group might not be able to consume it, you would say, is through parental censorship. So something like a parent might not let their child watch. So this was the case when I was growing up. I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons until I hit a certain age because Mum thought that some of the jokes were quite vulgar. And some of the themes she didn't appreciate. So, for example, when Homer chokes Bart, a father choking their kid, and we're meant to laugh and think that's funny. Mum wasn't really a fan of that sort of thing. So the parental censorship could prevent teenagers and younger children from having limited access because of their age. So that would be the only thing that would stop consumption. Class, when I'm talking about who has class, every class has it. So when we talk about class, we're talking about upper class, middle class, lower class. You could probably even have it split like this. Now, the main reason everyone has access to it is because, again, that stat says everyone has a TV nowadays, and that sitcoms can air on TV for free via free-to-air channels. So in that way, every class has access to it. What you'll also find is that middle to upper class can also afford the sitcom paraphernalia. They can also afford the Netflix subscriptions to watch more and consume it in different ways. Whereas the lower SES class may just have to stick to more traditional, conventional methods, such as watching it on free-to-air TV, consuming it via social media app accounts, which are also free, or watching show reruns from a DVD they might have borrowed or something from a friend. So in terms of class, everyone has access to it. The only difference in how they consume it is that the middle and upper class probably have access to the full range of sitcoms in terms of different ways to consume it, like we said, via streaming channels, their phone, wherever. Whereas low SES might just have to only look at it on TVs or traditional free methods. Moving on to ethnicity. So many ethnicities have access to sitcoms, although, caveat here, a cultural understanding of Western culture is important. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to engage with the humour. So what I mean by how do different ethnicities have access to it, if we look at globalization, sitcoms are very popular around the world. They're dubbed in heaps of different languages. There's subtitles in heaps of different languages. Each country has their own sitcoms as well, based on their own language too, just that Western culture ones are the most popular. So they technically have access to view it. The only caveat I've put is they might have difficulty to engage with it if they don't understand that Western cultural humour or that style of humour which often underpins each episode. For those that have a limited access, it would be those who do not belong to Western culture, and that's typically due to a language barrier or a cultural barrier. So things like a language barrier is quite obvious, like you just can't understand what they're saying, or they might not have your language dubbed or subtitled. What I mean by cultural barriers, and we're going to look at this a little bit later, is that certain countries ban certain sitcoms because of the cultural content in it. So for example, if we look at Modern Family, there is a same-sex relationship between Cam and Mitch. They also adopt a child. So in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, that kind of content or that particular sitcom is banned, and it's not allowed to be consumed because it goes against their cultural values and beliefs surrounding marriage and things about that, such as who you can have kids with, when you can have them, how you can have them, and that sort of thing. So their cultural barrier is there as well. Another cultural barrier, for example, is The Simpsons. There is an episode, any episode I think that features Apu is banned in India. The episode where Homer's trying to go to the toilet between the Twin Towers is banned in America. So there's a lot of cultural barriers that would limit the access in relation to ethnicity. In terms of how these ethnicities consume sitcoms, most sitcoms have its origins in Caucasian ethnicity, so US, UK. The continuity of access of sitcom language, so those famous one-liners that can transcend ethnic barriers, allow that consumption of sitcoms to continue to take place regardless of ethnicity. And then a different way that it can be consumed, again, the relationship of consumption due to ethnicity, is that even if it is in a different language, there's subtitles that can be dubbed, there's different ways to consume it there as well. So that's for ethnicity. Gender. In terms of our syllabus's definition of gender, males and females both have pretty fair access to sitcoms. Both males and females are represented in almost every single sitcom. The only thing that I would say, or a group that doesn't have access or limited access, or any, I don't think there is there, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a sitcom, a mainstream sitcom that has a transgender character in it? If you can think of one, please let me know. But as far as I'm aware, I haven't been able to find one as of yet. So just keeping that in mind. So how those different genders can consume it. So although both males and females will have access, how they consume it will depend on how their gender is represented in the show. So is it representing their gender in a patriarchal way or a progressive way? So if we look at things like Big Bang Theory. So in Big Bang Theory, for example, I have a lot of friends that refuse to watch it because of how they represent women within the show, because they see it as quite patriarchal and domineering. And it's similar to older sitcoms, the content that they might not find as funny because it's not relatable. And that can work both ways too, because you can see that, say for example, males might not be very fond of how certain males are represented as being patriarchal and too physical and domineering in previous sitcoms. And it works the other way as well. I know parents, and like my mum struggles to watch some contemporary sitcoms because of her beliefs as well, and how they were raised. So they would feel that their view of gender doesn't have access in more contemporary and newer sitcoms because it doesn't align with their values. However, as we know, popular culture needs to stay current and up to date with contemporary values for it to remain a popular culture. And in terms of how transgender people consume it, I don't think, like I said, I don't think there's any transgender representation in sitcoms that I'm aware of. So that could be tricky there. Location. So in terms of who has location, mostly, pardon me, bit of a burp there. Mostly everyone has access in terms of their location. Most people live, I guess, on a coast or in a more, you could say, affluent area where you've got access to, or you've got good reception to watch it on streaming for one. But you've also got access to shops. So you guys all live close enough to Erina Fair, to Woy Woy, Deepwater Plaza, whatever it's called. Different shops, Tuggerah, Westfield. Even if you don't, you can go drive to the big ones and get access there down in Sydney. So you've got access to merchandise, different paraphernalia that you can buy. Even online nowadays, you can shop for any of that via eBay, Catch, Wish, whatever it is. You can buy those things online too. And that's again due to the access to technology in relation to that. So that's pretty much who will have access. Now, the person who has limited access would be, and again, based off location here, is the geographically isolated. So those that have little access to internet, especially now that most of consumer viewing of sitcoms is through the internet, through streaming now, it would be tricky for them to watch it in that capacity. So they would have to rely on TV and DVDs, very much the old school way of watching it. So they still would have access, but here it's limited access. So we're not saying that they don't have any access at all, but it's just limited based on where they live. Consumers, and because I guess how they consume it. So when we're looking at this kind of how most people would consume it, because most people live in an area that's, you know, coastal in Australia, for example, or a bit inland, but it's still quite metropolitan. How would they would consume it very much, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that because the sitcom is related to their everyday life, you know, the sitcoms that we see, most people live in the city around the world. I'm not saying we do necessarily, but we have sitcoms that cater to how we live, those suburban family type sitcoms like The Simpsons and Everybody Loves Raymond, My Wife and Kids, etc. And then when most people live in the city, you've got a lot of things like Friends, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Seinfeld, all of those kind of shows can reflect location and how it's consumed. So they'd be able to relate better to that sitcom because that product mirrors their reality. As, or if you're in a, say you are a family and everyone sits down and watches a sitcom as a family, say something like Modern Family might mirror your reality. And so because it reflects our everyday life, the locations are very much reflected in the show of where most people live as well. People in disadvantaged areas geographically would have difficulty consuming sitcoms as the commercialized product, again, because of limited access to technology. Lastly, on our access and consumption is sexuality. So who has access? Predominantly heterosexual, because every sitcom has a heterosexual couple in it, as far as I'm aware. And increasingly homosexual or same-sex attraction is very much getting more represented now. So you would say that they have the most access. And who would have limited access would be traditionally homosexual or same-sex attraction. So if we look at anything from 2000s prior, I guess with the exception of Will and Grace, there was not much same-sex representation, or if it was, they definitely weren't a main character, and it was very much a joke or a side joke. So if you look at Friends, for example, Ross's ex-wife left him for a woman, but that again, like it was never talked about a base of love, there was always jokes about it, pretty much directed at Ross's way that he wasn't man enough to keep her, sort of thing. So traditionally they would have limited access if they were to watch sitcoms prior or from, I guess 2009s backwards. Today there's a lot more access for them in things like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, especially The Good Place and things like that. So the majority of sitcoms do align with those heterosexual views in terms of gender relationships, so male and female, getting married, having kids, that sort of thing. So in terms of how they would consume it, it very much mirrors their reality and aligns up. But again, pre-2010, there was limited gay protagonists, and a lot of jokes were discriminatory or xenophobic in their nature. Xenophobic meaning fear of someone who's different. So they wouldn't be able to consume it as well. So that's our magic table there. Hope you made notes on that, and I hope that explanation gave you a bit of a deeper understanding. When we're going to do this practice HSC question quickly, I'm going to break it down for you. You may need to, as a word up front, you may need to continue this in your books to finish it, or you might like to start it in your book straight away so it's all in the one place. Up to you, because it is quite a large 5 marker. So the HSC question is this: examine the relationship of access and consumption in one popular culture you have studied in relation to 2 of the following: age, class, ethnicity, gender, location, sexuality. So these are all things we just looked at here. So examine the relationship of access and consumption. So this is the table here on access and consumption. So you're talking about who accesses it and how they access it, almost. So what's the relationship there? So for example, do adults have access to it, or in relation to age, who has access to it and how do they consume it? Ethnicity, how do they consume it, or how does it affect their consumption? So say for ethnicity, it might affect how they consume it because they might not want to consume that particular episode or content of sitcoms because of how that represents their ethnicity. So examine the relationship between those 2 things in sitcoms. So examine, we know, is explain on steroids. It's when you're giving a really detailed account of cause and effect. And you only have to do it in 2 of the following. So you don't have to pick all 6. The HSC has asked questions in society and culture like this before, where you have to pick one out of the thing. So my suggestion would just be pick the 2 that you're most comfortable with writing, or the ones that connect with you or speak to you the most. And so I would do 1 peel paragraph on each of those things. Again, do not need an introduction, do not need a conclusion for a 5 marker. Get straight into your peels. Okay. So your first sentence, if you're looking at something like, say, gender, for example, might be, your first sentence might be something like, typically males and females have great access to sitcoms and can consume it frequently. However, transgender people do not have as much, or have limited access to sitcoms and therefore cannot consume it. That might be a point there that you could make, then give your examples. Again, examples here can be looking at, this is probably more the explanation part of it. So an example here you could say is just reference, or your example could be most sitcoms, from the 80s to current has adequate representation of males and females. Although the trick here might be whether or not they represent it in a patriarchal or progressive manner. Okay, and then you might want to talk about how there's no evidence for transgender representation in sitcoms, and therefore their relationship and access to it isn't there. So that could be an interesting point there as well. But that's the question broken down there. Again, it's only 2. You're not going to write about 3, you're not going to write about 1, you're going to write about 2. And 1 popular culture is sitcoms. Good luck. See me if you have any questions. Good luck.